a very brief introduction. There you go, the recording started. Doing a very brief introduction, talking about how this topic came about. At the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, we have a fairly deep expertise when it comes to technology and the use of technology in humanitarian action, especially in constrained environments, and around principles and really how to do this in a manner that is ethical and concerned with the protection of people served by humanitarian actors. And at the same time, we've developed over the years a pretty deep expertise around negotiation, around humanitarian negotiation, access negotiation, through a series of courses that are offered by HHI and research on this topic. And as often happens during the course of discussion and brainstorming on these topics, we realized that the connection between the two was not really well explored within HHI, and we quickly realized wasn't very well explored outside of HHI as well. Hence the idea of looking in somewhat systematic manner at the changes, the opportunities, the threats that are presented by the use of technology by various actors, humanitarian themselves, but also parties to conflict, communities themselves. How is this changing humanitarian negotiation? So this is really what generated this idea. And in researching what the state of the discussion was on this, we found, in fact, very little. We found that while there were concerns that were expressed, there was not necessarily a whole lot of case studies, reflection, a lot of data on this topic. And so we wanted this first seminar to be very exploratory. So what we are going to have today is very much a discussion on a topic that we all are aware is important, but on which really scholarship is not very advanced, reflection is not necessarily formalized, hence knowledge management is not really happening. And so we see that there is really important opportunities to improve lessons learned on this topic. So I'll stop here and hand over to my colleagues. I just want to first acknowledge both Ines Isimbi and Emily Ng on the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative side for putting this together and making it happen. And I also want to thank Saira, who will be moderating this discussion, Saira Khan, who is really leading our work on digital inclusion, work on digital divide and how to mind the digital divide in humanitarian action as part of an effort that we are going to have over the next few years, including a number of case studies and again, trying to build lessons learned on these topics. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you for the panelists for being here. And Saira, I hand the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for being here of this ENP webinar, looking at technology and negotiation. Just to give you an idea, the Executive Negotiation Project is a professional development program looking at opportunities for humanitarian practitioners, looking again at this intersection that Patrick has mentioned on innovation and negotiation. And so that's, as you said, where this comes from. So it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. I'll do this very briefly to allow them to have plenty of time to speak about their own experiences and perspectives on this subject. So this is also the order in which they will be speaking and I will be presenting them. So first we have Max Bevilacqua, who's the founder and principal of Max Negotiating, an LLC, which is a global consulting and training firm specializing in ransomware, humanitarian and environmental negotiation. He has also been recently engaged on this subject in collaboration with HHI. So we're excited to have him speak a little bit about some of his learnings there. And then next we have Alice Maillot, who is a humanitarian practitioner at the International Committee of the Red Cross, and where she serves as a strategic advisor. And she has a background in international relations and business administration, and is also conducting research on humanitarian diplomacy, especially taking a look at the advantage of technologies and digital tools to achieve diplomatic objectives. And then we have Rob Grace, who is a researcher and affiliated fellow at the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies at Brown University. He was also previously affiliated with HHI. And his research is focused on the politics and practice of humanitarian negotiation and humanitarian military relations. And then last but not least, we have Ziad Al-Achkar, who is a PhD candidate at the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University, and he's also affiliated with the Better Evidence Project. And his research is focused on the use of digital technologies in support of peace building and humanitarian action, and also the evolving relationship with the technology sector. So with that, each of our panelists will make some brief remarks on humanitarian tech and negotiation based on some of their research background, as I just described. And please keep in mind that they'll be speaking on behalf of themselves, not their organizations. But with that, I'll pass it over to Max. Take it away.
Saira and Patrick, thank you so much for that introduction. As mentioned, along with Patrick and Saira, I've been conducting an initial review of the literature on the uses of technology in humanitarian negotiations. When you're reading these insightful papers, you see the authors and they become somewhat mythical to you. So to be alongside them today on this august panel is a real treat. As Patrick mentioned, our first finding is that there's not a lot out there, and that is probably one of the headlines in and of itself. The literature that does exist focuses primarily on social media platforms, but has little to say about large swaths of the digital space like the darknet, machine learning, or the use of cryptocurrency, and it rarely goes deep into the technical aspects of these issues. And this makes a lot of sense because, broadly speaking, I'm not sure that technical expertise is native to the humanitarian organization, which we can debate, in the same way that humanitarian considerations aren't native to private sector tech companies. So there's a lot to be discussed about partnerships between international organizations, IOs, and tech companies and service providers. And on the other hand, if we look at the effect of the World Food Programme's partnership with Palantir and the suspicion it raised with Yemen's Houthi government, we see that tech partnerships can also be a barrier to access. The ethics of data collection aside, which is a large thing to set aside, ensuring the protection of highly sensitive data that is collected from vulnerable populations is a major theme in the literature, especially in conflict zones and fragile states, much more so than in responding to natural disasters. Humanitarian tools can become weapons. A question I'm posing here is there's such a thing as non-exploitable tech. Our other issue is that high volume of data doesn't mean high quality information, and programmers program their biases into the platforms based on their own quirks and idiosyncrasies. So the illusion of objectivity, I think, is a problem here as well. This is all not to mention that unequal access to technology means that technical solutions may exacerbate those inequalities. Lastly, from my perspective, one of the most intuitive but poignant takeaways is that the success of humanitarian operations, access negotiations with host governments, mediations amongst armed groups, communications with vulnerable populations, rely upon the ability to build trust. And most of the literature concludes that there's no digital substitute for face-to-face interaction when it comes to building trust. So very much in the spirit of inquiry and not answers, I have some questions that are genuine questions that I'm sure the other august panelists will interact with. But how do we define the digital humanitarian space? Where does it begin and where does it end? What does proactive data governance and security look like? Who and what are the resources that IOs need to be leaders in this space? Not just competent, but leaders. What does it look or sound like to be consistent with humanitarian principles in a digital space? Is there such thing as an impartial tweet in an age of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech? How also does one abide by the principle of humanity in a digital form? What does beneficiary inclusivity look like in all of these considerations? And finally, with the ability to create more efficient delivery of service and with access to larger networks, what resources are we missing in this conversation and which would be most useful to create? And with that, I'm handing you off to the very capable hands and mind of Alice Maillot.
Thank you, Max, and greetings to everyone who has joined today. Thank you also to Patrick and Saira for the invitation. So digital disruption is everywhere, and the research I conducted showed that humanitarian diplomacy, that is to say, our capacity to build trust, to influence, to negotiate, and to keep the door open to all parties to a conflict, is not immune to it. Indeed, the involving nature of the diplomacy, from the so-called club diplomacy to network diplomacy, where the practice is no longer restricted to nation states, is facilitated by digital technologies. So the mode of conducting diplomacy with the help of technologies and the impact this has on contemporary negotiation practices is called digital diplomacy. So in this presentation, I will share three main ideas. First, the prevalent image, and you mentioned it, Max, is that digital diplomacy is only about social media, whereas it is much broader than that. Second, Digital diplomacy brings risks, of course, challenges, but also opportunities. And third, looking at future trends, there will be an increasing role of digital diplomacy as complementary practice to humanitarian negotiations. So for each of these three ideas, we have a PowerPoint slide, and the first one, thank you, Ines. So there is no official definition for digital diplomacy. But as a starting point, I looked at how two pioneering countries, in the domain, so the US and Estonia, structure their digital diplomacy efforts. So both countries have 5 main clusters: knowledge management, information management, public diplomacy, external expertise, and virtual representation. So in my research, I adapted these clusters to humanitarian diplomacy work, and I came out with the following criteria to assess humanitarian organizations' digital diplomacy capacity. So under the first one, knowledge management, how an organization gathers, retains, and shares its own knowledge on humanitarian diplomacy, meaning proper use of internal data and negotiation experience. For information management, the important questions are how the organization accesses, filters, and sorts external openly available information and data in order to support a fact and evidence-based humanitarian negotiation effort, and in order to get a sense of the decision-making processes, the interests, and the opinions of their interlocutors. With public diplomacy, we touch upon perception management. With billions of people connected online, how do we connect with stakeholders? How do we target relevant groups and deliver tailor-made messages? How do we identify influencers on a given topic to persuade them? How to communicate and mobilize in a timely manner? How to measure our influence on social media? External resources. In a humanitarian organization, what are the mechanisms to identify and use external expertise for better humanitarian diplomacy efforts? How to build communities of practice and network of experts? And the final one, virtual representation. In contexts where access to communities is difficult or impossible, how to ensure virtual proximity? How to engage virtually with our interlocutors who are not willing or maybe who are unable to discuss face-to-face. I'm thinking here about countries opening virtual embassies, or even going further, a country like Barbados opening a virtual embassy in the metaverse. So now we've gone through the definition of what we're talking about. Let's move to the second slide. We are all aware that the digital environment creates a new space to do harm. And I'm sure we will address this during the discussion. So I would prefer to address now 2 challenges and 2 opportunities brought by digital diplomacy. So first challenge is about perception and the fact that with access to digital technologies, almost every staff member of humanitarian organization can have an influence on their organization's reputation and therefore have an indirect impact on the conduct of humanitarian negotiations. Therefore, it is important that staff members understand their responsibility and the consequences of poor digital behavior. It is also important to train all humanitarian staff and not only those in charge of negotiations. In a way, we are all ambassadors of our organizations. Another challenge is about clarity and consistency. With an increasing variety of platforms where humanitarian organizations are present, and with the speed with which messages have to be delivered, there is an increasing challenge to convey clear and consistent messaging. The credibility of humanitarian institutions during negotiations is at stake. So still from a humanitarian diplomacy perspective, there are opportunities, such as extending IHL dissemination and prevention activities. You mentioned it, Max, again. I'm thinking here of the darknets, for example, which is part of cyberspace where humanitarian diplomacy action is not driven. That said, some groups hold huge digital territory in the darknet, allowing the dissemination without control of messages, supporting attacks on civilians as a means of war, and allowing the recruitment of followers. The future may even be more about the conduct of hostile digital operations rather than the conduct of hostilities in the physical ground. Another opportunity, and again, Max, you definitely mentioned everything, is to increase our human-centered design capacity by giving an opportunity to a greater amount of people to have a voice, to hear others, and to engage for meaningful impact. there was a question sent by a participant about what user centricity means for large NGOs. And I would say that part of the answer is to enable communities to be consulted and involved in the design of humanitarian response. The capacity to do so is increased by technology, and it contributes to building acceptance and trust. Moving now to my last slide to discuss further future trends. First trend, increased virtual representation. On the model of digital embassies, there could be digital delegations to engage with communities where humanitarian organizations do not have access. Such a model would imply that the privileges and immunities of international humanitarian organizations are preserved and protected in the digital space. Second trend, digital sovereignty. Due to the network nature of the internet and the power of tech companies, you mentioned it again, Max, it is very difficult, even for states, to have the full control of how they use their data. So, of course, humanitarian organizations are not, it's not easier for us. So it is important that we continue to explain how our capacity to operate depends on confidentiality and on our digital sovereignty. Last trend, blockchain technology and the possibilities it offers to remove intermediaries while guaranteeing identity privacy. This technology could be interesting to explore to protect the data of the people we serve. Such a technology, in theory, could enable humanitarian organizations to identify people in need, to serve them without knowing their identity. This could, in theory, prevent mishandling of data. So before turning the floor to Rob, sorry, I would like just to mention that although I took the ICRC as a subject for my research, these findings do not necessarily reflect the official position of the ICRC on the topic. So I'll stop there, look forward for the discussion, and over to you, Rob, Grace.
Thanks a lot, Alice. I'm going to use my time here to make 4 key points. The first point I want to make is that the gap on which this whole webinar is premised is very real. And I, as a researcher who has been examining humanitarian negotiation, am absolutely responsible for this gap. I've been doing research on humanitarian negotiation for years, starting when I used to be at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. I've produced reports, journal articles on humanitarian negotiation, as well as now in my role at the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies on humanitarian military relations. I have absolutely examined the role of technology in humanitarian negotiation in some of these pieces, but you do have to look very hard to find the points in my research where I have examined it. So I'm very glad that HHI is looking at this issue very closely. It's an important gap to be filled. Max and Alice have already laid out various ways that the intersection is very important. I'm just going to add a few things onto it. Point 2 that I'm going to make, this comes from research that I've done on humanitarian military relations and how in a different information and communication environment, there's a need to rethink the way things are done. Looking at humanitarian military relations, there's a very classical framework that many of you out there might know, sometimes referred to as the 3 C's framework, that envisions different types of contexts and the different levels of engagement that should exist between humanitarians and military actors. And the basic idea is that there's a spectrum of, on the one side, there's cooperation. On the other side, there's mere coexistence. In cooperation, there can be more in-depth cooperation between humanitarians and military actors, where military actors are actually brought into relief operations and military assets are used. And typically that's thought of as something that can and should occur in natural disaster response contexts. At the other end of the spectrum, coexistence is the sense that humanitarians should really keep their distance from military actors in complex emergencies because of all of the risks to their perceptions and potential ways in which humanitarian principles can be compromised and the sensitivities around that in complex emergencies. So that's all very well and good if you're looking at a context-specific type of situation. It's not all well and good in the current environment, where let's say you're in a natural disaster, and let's say you're a humanitarian organization that is working very closely in a natural disaster context with, say, a government that is friendly with the West. And you're a global NGO who's also working in another context where you're trying to get access to territory controlled by a non-state armed group that's very hostile to the West. So if in this context, say, there's media attention on this relationship, there are pictures of you and the military circulating on social media, that's going to affect your ability to get access potentially in this other context, even if it's halfway across the world. So that's just one way in which a social media environment actually requires us to rethink, re-examine frameworks of how humanitarians and militaries can cooperate and the relationships that they can and should build with one another. Point 3 that I'll raise is about humanitarian notification systems. Another way that there's an intersection between technology, access, and humanitarian negotiation. Humanitarian negotiation systems are mechanisms of information sharing, where humanitarians can share information about their activities and whereabouts with militaries, the idea being that they can share that information so the military knows that they should not target those areas so that they will not harm ongoing humanitarian operations. So humanitarian notification systems are an example of something where there is this issue, there are security risks, and some of the response to that issue is that a technical solution is required. Because if you're a humanitarian organization sharing information with militaries about your whereabouts, it requires a great deal of information management. And the way it has been done initially is basically humanitarian organizations creating these massive Excel spreadsheets that they transfer over to the military. They have to constantly update these spreadsheets. They are not resourced to update these spreadsheets. So they're sending over all this information, but they're sometimes not able to keep it up to date. Sometimes it's not accurate. So there's a technical solution required to address this issue of information sharing, a better technical system of sharing information in real time. So that's the technical aspects of it, but there are aspects of humanitarian notification systems that are potentially problematic that a technical solution cannot address, such as the fact that it can distort the combatants' perception of their obligations under IHL, if they sort of think of the system as a replacement for their own obligation to do their own assessment of what they're targeting is civilian or military in nature. So want to put that on the table of another component of this discussion. And finally, my fourth and final point I'll just say is that all of these issues, all of these challenges that we're talking about are very much likely to get worse in the future. Let me flag as a teaser an upcoming publication of mine that will be coming out very soon. It's about humanitarian access during great power conflict with a focus on large-scale combat operations. Militaries are preparing for these types of conflicts. It is important that humanitarians also do so as well. These conflicts are going to have a very significant component of cyber in them. There are going to be information and cyber operations. We already see that as a big concern in the context unfolding in Ukraine. I will leave it there. Hopefully I've put some interesting things on the table for further discussion. Ziad, I will kick it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you so much, Patrick and Saira, for hosting this important discussion. And thanks, Max and Adis, for some very thoughtful points. I'm going to try to keep it as short as possible. And similar to Rob, I think I have a few points I'm going to raise. I'm also responsible as an academic and researcher for that gap. I've done a lot of work and studies on research and publications on technology used by humanitarians. And while the issue of negotiation doesn't come up, I can see in how every single one of the things that I've done that ought to have been a bigger focus. And I want to kind of bring it to the issue of what I call acceptance. And I think this is where negotiations and technology ultimately come back to. What are ways by which technology can improve or disrupt acceptance by humanitarian organizations and affected populations? I think is a very important case to explore. We've seen over the past 15 years this explosion of technology and access. And to Rob's point, and to at least in Max, nowadays, millions and billions of people have access to smartphones, they have access to different types of technology, to new ways of communicating and building movements and to sharing information. Mobile banking has exploded, which has allowed humanitarians to do a lot more, to do work in a very different way. So on a point of, for example, cash aid, that's part of it is humanitarian negotiations. Humanitarian organizations have to now negotiate with banks. They have to negotiate with telecommunication networks as to how they're going to provide these types of resources. And so that's kind of a new facet that humanitarian actors have to build up capacities for. It's kind of another toolkit that humanitarians are going to have to develop as we progress forward. And so while thinking about kind of how does technology change the landscape for humanitarian negotiation, the way I see it, it kind of adds new layers and complexity, and it adds new ways that humanitarians have to actually negotiate. It changes kind of the landscape for humanitarian negotiations. There's levels of negotiations that are different. It's no longer just simply kind of, negotiations between the state and the humanitarian organizations to access a particular space, or humanitarian negotiations and affected populations. We have a complexity of new actors. There's interconnectedness. On the one hand, you're having to negotiate with Salesforce and Facebook and Palantir and all the big tech companies to get access to resources and technologies and software. But on the flip side of it, you also have to negotiate with affected populations about what kind of data are we allowing our affected populations have here, except in return for specific types of aid. You have to negotiate with network providers and the governments as to what kind of data is being collected and how it's going to be stored and who's going to have access to it and what kind of level of personal identifiable or group identifiable, demographically identifiable information are in play. So I think this kind of landscape of humanitarian negotiations, especially as it comes to this interconnectedness between these new actors, it is very critical. And I think that's the big gap there, is to understand how do all of that change kind of this notion of acceptance? Because at the end of the day, humanitarian actors the main purpose is to help and alleviate suffering, but most importantly to be there and work with affected populations. And so to kind of put that at the center of our thinking about, well, how does this new landscape of digital innovation and kind of digital negotiation play a role? And most of you probably have heard about the ICRC hack, and this kind of raises other questions as well about this level of negotiation that I think is often missing from the conversation. Elise brought up IHL, and Max and Rob touched upon it on the issues of CivMil and kind of notification systems. I think what is really missing is this high-level political engagement and high-level negotiations about, well, how does IHL expand into the digital realm? And how does it apply? Do we need new kind of form? Do we need a new, to some of our colleagues bring up the notion of a digital Geneva Convention, right? What is it that we actually need to be engaged in as humanitarian negotiators to ensure, the promise of technology? And to quickly wrap up, I think there's a lot of talk that happens in theory, right? In theory, we hope that technology adds democratization, it allows for more transparency, it allows for better communications. In practice, it's a lot more challenging, and oftentimes it seems that our use cases for the last decade or so, the promise of technology to be this democratizing force to provide more voice to the affected populations hasn't transferred. It hasn't materialized, and so that's one of my big questions as we engage in this. Well, how do we change that? Is it possible to change it when a lot of the software and the hardware is being developed thousands of miles away and programs aren't designed by the affected populations? How do we change that landscape? How do we get more people involved as part of this kind of humanitarian negotiator toolkit? And so I'll end it there.
Wonderful. Thank you to all our panelists for these excellent remarks. And it was so great to see how many different perspectives we can have this conversation about. And so I appreciate all of your input on that. To the audience and listeners, there is a Q&A, so please feel free to drop questions as we go into the discussion portion of this. There's a lot to unpack here, and I think each of you have brought up really interesting points. And to get us started, and we can, morph the conversation in any way you would wish to take it. There are so many themes to think about, and particularly thinking about acceptance just now, as Ziad was sharing, and others as well. I want to unpack this idea of trust a little bit, given that, especially when we're thinking about the role of technology and kind of, well, the things that have gone wrong in the past, but then also in the mistrust of that as we move forward. To the panelists, and I think maybe Ziad, you can begin to address first, just to give some organization to the conversation, and then we can take it how we go. How do you think that we can begin to build trust with ICTs when we're thinking about its role in negotiation and just in humanitarian sector, generally speaking, given that it's a cause for mistrust as well. So how can we begin to change the conversation a little bit to rebuild it using technologies in negotiation?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that is often missing is transparency. I think that's the key step towards building trust, is for humanitarian organizations to be as transparent as possible about why they're using specific technology, what are they doing with the data, how it's being stored, for what purposes, for how long, and to engage the people who are mostly affected by this directly, not at the end of a program before they implement it. So engaging the affected populations from early on in the planning and design to then move into the implementation. I think, through technology, we have so many ways to make things a lot more transparent. There's a lot more better ways that humanitarians can communicate, and using kind of not this high technical language that even those of us who are in the field sometimes are confused about what we're actually trying to say. And so I think transparency is key. I think engaging populations is critical. And I think one of the things that humanitarians sometimes forget when engaging in kind of this digital world is that we have a duty of care towards the people that we're working with, and keeping that hat on, not just relying on these notions of like the informed consent that is often not really an informed consent. Let's go back to this notion of duty of care and do no harm, and meaningfully applying it to the digital humanitarian space.
Let me hop in as well. Couldn't agree more with what Ziad said. Also, just wanted to connect it to a couple of the comments, a couple of the questions that were raised in the Q&A. There's the questions about monitoring and evaluation and community-led monitoring and evaluation. Just wanted to sort of bring in another context that I'm doing research on that speaks to all of these issues, which is the crisis in Rukban along the Jordan-Syrian border. So this is a situation where there was a large population of forcibly displaced Syrians that began to amass along the border between Syria and Jordan. Jordan, due to security concerns, essentially closed the border. So you have humanitarians operating from Jordan trying to reach Syria, unable to do so. And it eventually trying to find creative ways to do it. And one way was to use implementing partners that were private contractors, but they had the problem of monitoring and evaluation, to which some did apply a technical solution, trying to give their implementing partners, some cameras, some video, so they could at least get some evidence that the aid reached its intended recipients. They used drones as well. Limited impact there. But what was also pursued was to train the community themselves there to undertake their own M&E. And that is what was pursued. They actually used Kobo. I know Patrick will be perhaps happy to hear that, given that he created Kobo. But Yeah, it's building on Ziad's point of sort of putting the population at the center, bringing them into the process in a way that is integrated with how you're applying tech solutions to your access difficulties.
Maybe to add to what Ziad and Rob just said, complementary to this and to this user centricity, human-centered design, it is also at a political level that we need to influence and to make understand that a safe digital space need to be created for humanitarians. And something that I remember you brought in your research, Ziad, and I'm allowing myself to share it here, is also the importance to talk about the link between the digital, the breach in security and the physical harm it can do on the most vulnerable. So hacking or getting access to data of the most vulnerable in the end, will probably bring to physical harm to the most vulnerable. So I think on these two arguments to continue and influence at political level.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you, Rob, for already beginning to answer some of the questions coming in from the audience. I think I wanted to, in considering actually some of the comments that are coming in, when we're thinking, I think it would be nice to dig a little bit more about these safe digital spaces. So I think, again, we talked about IHL, talked about the digital norms. Have any of you really been seeing progress in this area? What does a safe digital space look like in the humanitarian sector? And I know that's a big question as well. Please feel this is again an exploratory discussion. So any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll jump in, or Max. No, okay. That's a very critical question, and I think the last experience of the last year showcases that there's less safe digital space than we've had in the past. I think there is a lot more nefarious actors, put them this way, private sector, state-sponsored, or direct state actors who are now increasingly seeing value in kind of operating this kind of gray zone of, is this an IHL violation, is this not, into getting access and hacking of whether it's directly hacking, humanitarian data sets and databases for information, or what we're seeing increasingly is network. And I think there was a question in the chat about network disturbances, cutting off internet. And so I think we're seeing this landscape evolve and going backwards to less openness and less kind of protection and safe environments, which then on the humanitarian side raises the question of how do we then push back against this from a high level political area, less on the technical on one end. So how do we engage states and how do we engage kind of the private sector in these kind of collaborations to build up better and safer environments digitally, but then to also on the critical side of like humanitarian planning and design of projects is to question, seriously, like what is the data we're collecting? How necessary is it? Do we really need to have this high level, very deep, very personal level of information about every single person that the sector engages with? Elise's earlier point about blockchain technology and trying to figure out ways that maybe we don't need that kind of level. Maybe there's technical ways to get around that. I think these are the two tensions I see currently.
Maybe on the digital Geneva Convention, I think you mentioned it earlier. One of my fellow panelists mentioned it. So I'm not a lawyer, so I won't be able to discuss that in very much detail. But what we know is that cyberspace is considered as a battlefield. So Geneva Convention, as they are, should already apply to the cyberspace. So we don't necessarily, in theory, from a non-lawyer point of view, need digital Geneva Convention.
I also think the idea of a digital Geneva Convention is fascinating because in some ways to my ears, it also sounds like a contradiction. Alice has talked about the paradigm shift from traditional club diplomacy, if I have that right, Alice, to network diplomacy. I'm not sure that large scale international organizations, and I don't know, but I'm not sure that they've accepted that paradigm shift based on their structure and the talent and resources that they do or don't recruit. For instance, talking about the dark web, I can understand why ICRC wouldn't want to be on the dark web, and I don't think avoidance is a compelling strategy for any of us, or at least for myself. So I don't know what a digital Geneva Convention would look like, but from my perspective, this also asks some larger questions, bigger questions that maybe are in the wrong direction, but in my mind are we realists or are we liberalists in some ways in terms of largely speaking about how we see the world? I don't expect international agencies to stop targeting IOs. They have relatively low data security and high value information. I believe that normatively, they shouldn't, from like a liberalization standpoint, there should be digital safe spaces, but I think I'm happy to play the role of digital pessimist in terms of saying, I expect there's attitudinal inherency in these actors. And with that said, what is the moral calculus of do no harm? Is it more utilitarian? I think it might be. I don't feel as comfortable with that. I like the idea much more of, deontological impartiality in everything we do. But insofar as it's available for reinterpretation, and we haven't even talked about deep fakes, right? Rob, you were giving this fantastic hypothetical, which I don't think is super hypothetical about Civ Mill work. Yeah, I can make a photo or even a video of a humanitarian worker wearing something that they shouldn't be wearing. So I think the issue that I'd like to just complicate further is verifiability. How, who, and based on some of the things that we're seeing in the chat that I also be mindful of, who verifies, right? Because there's another element for bias. So I think that community-led aspect is great. And then also I genuinely don't know, how does a group in diaspora or crisis have the bandwidth to monitor this? So I guess another question here is, does technical access, assuming internet access, which is another big assumption, does it democratize or does it exacerbate existing inequality? And I'm happy to play the devil's advocate of the pessimist here.
I think it's important to play devil's advocate here. I think there's again a lot to unpack in terms of that cyberspace and all the risks that it poses and how it will continue to evolve. So with that in mind, in particular, looking at one of the panelists, the audience questions. Do any of you have advice on change management around adopting certain technologies, or what are the right tools that are currently being used or are trustworthy, especially in facilitating negotiation when it comes to government, and especially in low-tech environments? What are some of the tools that could be used?
I'm going to jump in also and take a first stab at this. I'm going to be honest and say I don't know of a specific tool that is being used that makes that can help answer the question. And I'll also add to it that I think oftentimes the tool is very much dependent on the context of the environment you're operating in. I'm a big fan of low-tech technology in a lot of these environments because the reality is, while billions of people have access to smartphones and internet access, you can bet, as a Lebanese, I can tell you, you're going to lose internet access 17 times a day. You might not have electricity, for 20 hours a day to be able to charge all these devices. So low tech, low bandwidth kind of tools are incredibly important to be able to kind of collect information, to engage in this kind of work. Kobo is obviously one of the tools that fit that criteria to collect data and do survey work in a kind of responsible way that is low tech. And so I think the question ought not to be necessarily, what kind of tools are available, but how do we think about, how do we match tools to context? How do we match context to tool? How do we think about, doing proper data audits about, what the tool is going to collect and how it's going to be backed up and who can have access to it? I think kind of building up these kind of questions help you then go and look and find what tools there exist. And oftentimes, I'm going to be probably pretty honest, a lot of the tools won't match a lot of the criteria you're looking for. And this is where humanitarians end up going back to the private tech sector and building partnerships like WFP and Palantir work together to build this massive tool to do logistics work. DOTS is called DOTS. It's fascinating, very important, did not exist 2 years ago, it does now. So oftentimes the tools actually don't exist. And this is where the partnerships and negotiations with the private sector come into play.
So same here, I do not have a particular tool in mind, but what this makes me think about is also how the tools are created and how do we develop algorithm. And the way that we see algorithm can be, not can be, are biased. So how do we, as much as possible, prevent, limit the bias that we put in the algorithm? And also, how do we design algorithm with ethically? So ethics by design and as unbiased as possible by design. That's also another question. More questions than answers.
Also want to jump in as well and sort of flip it around a little bit. But what I'm going to say is I think in line with what Ziad was saying about making sure that the tech tools at your disposal are matched with the context at hand. But what I have in mind, as I mentioned, is the research I've been doing on the potential future of conflict, potential future of great power conflict. And basically what this project does is it imagines the possibility of direct head-to-head military combat between the US and, say, China or Russia, and imagines what that access environment might mean. And imagine what that might mean for humanitarian negotiation and broader issues of how humanitarians can operate. But what you're likely to see in such a scenario is targeting of infrastructure, targeting of communication technology infrastructure. So one way to prepare for such contexts is to actually scale back the tech tools that you're ready to use, and to prepare for an environment where you do not have access to all of the information at your disposal, which is a very important factor to consider if you're talking about access and you're talking about humanitarian negotiation, because going back to the first point that Saira raised, if you're a humanitarian operating in a volatile environment, you are looking to build connections with all of the relevant stakeholders in that area. You're looking to build relationships of trust, maintain relationships of trust, and maintain communication with them. You're looking to do that stakeholder mapping. And it's a question of how do you do that, and how do you sustain those communication networks if the actual tech infrastructure is not available to you.
And Rob, not only are these amazing points, but the voice in which you do it is really mesmerizing as well. So kudos to you on that. I guess I also just want to add to the point to kind of broach like neocolonialism themes. Given how Anglo-centric I think a lot of the private tech companies, at least large FANG tech companies are, at least from what I can tell, and I'm curious to the other panelists if they have other experiences, any flagging, verification, removal is mostly English, mostly based in English. And so even I think we've all work ahead of us for every other language, because even in English, I don't think we have particularly efficient systems, and the volume and velocity of the data is so intense that, you know, I'm a person that would prefer that we all write letters and have our own seals that we can verify. But insofar as that's not possible, I think we also just need to open the conversation to people that speak languages that aren't English and are less Western associated, because I think a large lesson of negotiations is it's not what, it's how. So the process determines the outcome, and anything that is imposed, especially by an Anglo-centric community, is going to smell like things that aren't palatable. And so I think a lot of my questions and further complications are about who is best to include, who would give criteria or a sense of legitimacy to the process of creating these tools. So I'm also dancing around the question of what change management tools are there. And I think my pithy response would be, it's not about the tool, it's about implementation. And it's the idea of, I'm not giving this to you, I'm not saving you, but how can I work with you to build something that makes sense in your context? And maybe, you know, to Ziad's point, it's lower tech, like the use of phone banks and in Haiti were fantastic, right? The conversations about, I think, artificial intelligence are less germane to that. So a long way of saying I'm not sure, but part of our findings in the lit review, again, are biased because of who we are. But even the fact that most of the papers were English, some in French, does reflect, I think, a lack of connectivity more broadly on the world stage.
So coming back to something that you said, Matt, oh, sorry, Ziad, did you want to add something?
I wanted to quickly just to jump on Mac's point, because there's a couple of questions about misinformation that I think is a nice segue to this whole notion of you know, finding tech solutions and you know, getting buy-in from communities. I think when it comes to misinformation, I think a lot of our problems, especially, is the fact that there's trust issues, there's issues related to acceptance, there's issues related to accountability, that I think oftentimes we put a lot of emphasis on. There's an element of it as technical, right? Taking down things, doing that kind of stuff. That's like, to Max's point, everybody's point, it's going to be impossible to get 100%. But the point is, I think, in the piece that I wrote on acceptance, is that we need to think about accountability and trust and transparency as kind of like the fuel that will spread the fire or turn it off about misinformation and things like that. My biggest concern is that increasing kind of technological use and reliance on remote management is increasing kind of this like disconnect between affected populations and communities and the organizations. People are kind of doing a lot of this work kind of remotely, and they're not actually ceding power to the people on the ground. And we've seen over the last decade, the attacks against aid workers, increased level of mistrust. I think part of it could be explained by this digital disconnect. But I think also a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's less and less accountability. There's very little accountability, let's be honest, from humanitarians to the populations that they're working with. There's less ceding of power. You know, we talk about localization, but it's not meaningful by any means, what we have right now. So I think tackling these issues require a non-technical, like, it's not technical, but 80% of our problems when it comes to misinformation and this kind of work is non-technical. 20% of it is, or maybe even less. So just something to kind of reflect upon.
So also addressing this this disconnect that you referred to, Ziad, and I think each of you actually in your own ways have brought up, is this idea of engaging closely with communities who are affected from conflict and negotiation practices. And this has also been posed in the chat a few times in the Q&A section. And one question in particular that I think is of interest, especially in addressing this disconnect and mistrust as well, is how can we move beyond the idea of being just user-centered design, just focusing on design of ethical algorithms or of practices? How can we truly bridge that gap in engaging and including communities in these negotiation processes and in their interactions with technology?
Okay, maybe I can give a first stab on this one. I'm thinking of an example during the COVID crisis and a campaign that we launched at the ICRC, the COVID-19 campaign, which is called Info as Aid. And we tried to actually address this misinformation and disinformation on the vaccine. And to do so, we conducted a 360-degree survey on the ground to understand the real the needs and the reasons why some communities may have been influenced by what they've read or heard through social media. So to understand what was the bottleneck, what was the real issue for these communities not to want to get vaccinated. So I would say that's a mean, for instance, to really go on site and interview and really create proper feedback mechanism to actually gather these needs and this feedback from the communities.
Let me also just jump in with sort of a broader point, sort of zooming out a bit more on humanitarian negotiation more broadly. But I feel as though discussions about humanitarian negotiations tend to follow a similar trajectory as I've been following them over the years. And there's been a transformation and evolution in how people talk about humanitarian negotiation. When it first arose, say 10, 15 years ago, there were handbooks that were coming out about how humanitarians can negotiate more effectively. And that was great. The negotiation was put on the map as a key competency for humanitarian actors. But what it did was it centered the analysis of humanitarian negotiation on the interaction between organizations and their interlocutors, combatants to armed conflict, other stakeholders in the environment. But what I see now is very much interconnected is this discourse on humanitarian negotiation, but these broader strands of policy discourse about how the humanitarian sector writ large should re-examine itself, should examine the ways in which it reproduces neocolonial structures. It links to the localization debate. And what it really is all about is this very question of putting the population at the center, putting the local community at the center, and how humanitarians can build on that. So I just wanted to flag that as like a key strand that I see in the state of general conversations about humanitarian negotiation. And I would see it very much linked to this discussion. How exactly the tech portions fit in, I'll leave that to my other panelists who are much more engaging on the tech issues to delve into more deeply.
So being mindful of time as we are closing in on the hour, I was wondering if perhaps each panelist could maybe in a 30-second summary, give an idea of what you see as the major threats and the major opportunities. And we've talked about so many things today that I know that's very difficult to do, but perhaps a closing comment, if you will, and perhaps we can do it in order in which we started. So Max, maybe we'll start with you. And then once Ziad finishes up, maybe over to Patrick to close things, and then we'll stop at that. Go ahead, Max.
Wow, it's a good metaphor here of being overwhelmed by all the data. So first of all, thank you again, everyone who came and my co-panelists for bringing up these points. I think for me, I'd like to see more productive and hearty conflict between private tech companies and international organizations, which is to say, where are the tech experts to tell us why all the things we're saying are wrong and don't make sense and are misguided? And where are humanitarians to come into those conversations and say, normatively speaking or in practice, we can't do that. And so I guess I'm looking for more common ground, because I'm noticing a lot of the literature is coming from international organizations' perspective, as opposed to someone who's purely a programmer saying like, okay, well, here are the considerations, because I don't even know what they are. So I think the velocity and volume of information is a big takeaway for me. And I'm also just wanting to note, very interesting, Rob, noting the trajectory of conversations, that it's kind of hard to look away from the risks. And I think that the risks even cognitively dominate and kind of crowd out our opportunities conversation. I don't know what the opportunities are, but I think maybe even having procedurally that as a separate conversation is just helpful for brainstorming, where we can say, okay, we know there are risks, but just for fun, how can we option generate what we're doing and share resources? So yeah, the risks are scary, and I think the opportunities are still to be explored.
I will take the digital security angle for this short conclusion. I think that we need to partner with within the sector to actually build security capacity within our systems. And this is also something that maybe our donor community will need to back us for, to back the community for that, to build this capacity in terms of digital security.
Listen, I'm going to jump in and say, I know that no one wants to hear a researcher saying that there's more research needed in the field that they happen to be researching, but I'm going to say that I do think that very glad that HHI is doing research in this area, but I do think that what is important is to really capture the state of this intersection, to really map out what communication platforms are being used, how people are using them, what challenges and opportunities they are seeing, and then spinning that out into different ways that can be transformed into modules in workshops and so on and so forth. But that's what sort of how the field of humanitarian negotiation has evolved. It sort of started in a very broad way, but now that it's sort of more developed as a field, we can go more deeply into particular issues. And I think this is an interesting and important one to continue to spin out. So go HHI, keep up the good work.
Yeah, to follow up, I think two quick things that come to mind. One is, and this kind of touches on one of the questions in the Q&A, is I think we need better partnerships between the organizations themselves, the humanitarian organizations, better synergies on data collection and using platforms and not asking the same data from a different organization to the same person. So this is one way technology could be helpful and help also then build capacities for humanitarian negotiators and their toolkits. Then the second point is I think we need more, and we need actually accountability in the systems and how we use the technology and how people who are affected or harmed by this use of technology have to have some sort of recourse towards level of justice and accountability, so that we can build trust and we can build acceptance and we can maximize the impact positively of these tools.
Well, thank you, everyone. And I had not anticipated coming back, but in the minute or so that I have, I want to first thank all the participants. I think the richness of the discussion, the exchange online, and I apologize we were not able to go through every question, but it shows that, one, this is a vast topic, a complex topic, but one that is really of interest to many, many stakeholders. And I want to emphasize, and not to end on a dim note, but how practical and important those considerations are. We have seen it in Afghanistan, we've seen it in Myanmar around misinformation, we've seen it in Tigray with blackout on communication, we've seen it repeatedly being current concerns that are really affecting both the security of humanitarian actors, of communities that are served by humanitarians, and really how they are able to operate. And while there already have been adverse consequences, it is clear that we cannot wait until major disasters, digital disasters, happen because of our failure to engage with these topics. And so again, we are committed and look forward to work with all of you on these issues, recognizing the fundamental importance to get it right, to advance the responsible use of technology in negotiation and the strategic use of technology in negotiation to make humanitarian actions more effective. So hopefully stay tuned for more on this topic. And I know we will have also further events focused on negotiation. Again, thank you to the panelists for what personally I think was a fascinating discussion, far-ranging discussion. And we look forward to the next events. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all.
Saira.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.